Welcome to the Book of Mormon Digging Deeper. Today, I'm going to delve into a very controversial subject and one about which the church urges us to be careful. Indeed, caution is the word of the day. I want to talk about the geography of the Book of Mormon, and I must address the reluctance of many to discuss this subject. I respect those who feel thus, but I'd like to offer my opinion on why they feel this way. And let me say, there's nothing wrong with being reluctant to discuss the geography. It's just that I think the reasons for doing so are out of date now. I have said many times now during these episodes that the Book of Mormon was not the only book to say some of the things it says, just the first. And I've made the point that in Joseph Smith's day, many of the claims from the Book of Mormon ran contrary to current opinion. In that case, it was prudent not to get too involved in geography or other cultural or specific matters with the book. There was no way to prove them. Even for our current leaders, remember, they grew up for the most part in the early part of the 20th century. President Nelson, for example, was born in 1925 and matured at a time when many of the things we know now were still mysteries. Hugh Nibley, one of my favorite heroes, was born even earlier, and he never paid much attention to the geography, but that was because in those days the knowledge that we have today just simply didn't exist. But things have changed, and today we have science on our side. We can now claim that 85% of the once disputed claims have been verified. More on that later. I must acknowledge right up front that the church urges us to be very careful how we present this subject. In fact, let me quote President Nelson here. He said, "Interesting as these matters may be, study of the Book of Mormon is most rewarding when one focuses on its primary purpose, to testify of Jesus Christ. By comparison, all other issues are incidental." I happen to agree completely with President Nelson. It is the teachings and the revealed doctrines of the Book of Mormon, along with its profound testimony of the true nature of our Savior and his visit to this land, that is of paramount importance. Nevertheless, anyone who really reads carefully the words of the ancient prophets will quickly realize that they took great pains to give us as many clues and as many details as they could with respect to the geography as they told their stories. And so I request your indulgence as I carefully, tepidly perhaps even, delve into this subject. Not for testimony building per se, but for enlightenment as to just what the Book of Mormon prophets took great pains to share with us. While traveling in Zion's camp in 1834, Joseph wrote to his wife Emma that they were, quote, wandering over the plains of the Nephites, recounting occasionally the history of the Book of Mormon, roving over the mounds of that once beloved people of the Lord, picking up their skulls and their bones as a proof of its divine authenticity. But then, in 1842, the church newspaper, the Times and Seasons, published articles under Joseph Smith's editorship that identified the ruins of ancient native civilizations in Mexico and Central America as further evidence of the Book of Mormon's historicity. So, which of these should we believe? Was it the plains of the United States that was home to the Nephites, or was it the highlands and lowlands of Central America where all the action took place? Well, believe it or not, both of these thoughts may be correct, at least to some degree. And today I'd like to show you how I can say that. To be sure, I believe that almost all of the action we read about, the wars, the battles, and so on, took place in Central America, but there is also clear and strong evidence of a Nephite presence, and for that matter, of a Jaredite presence before them in what is today the continental United States as well. And we'll get into that. There are very many important clues and direct statements made by Book of Mormon prophets intentionally pointing us to a deeper understanding of where they were and what the conditions were that they had to survive in, to live in, and to fight in. We are constantly told about the east side of this, or the west side of that, or by the river on the east side, or north to the narrow neck of land, and so on. The book is literally a travelogue of the settlements and migrations of so many people. Now, this from Gospel Topics in the church's website. Speaking of the book's history and geography, President Russell M. Nelson taught, many Book of Mormon scholars, particularly in recent decades, believe the text itself favors a less expansive, or limited, geographical setting for most of the Book of Mormon events. The two most notable proposed limited geography models are based in Mesoamerica and in the Great Lakes area of North America. Another source says this: many LDS scholars believe that the Book of Mormon geography is centered in Mesoamerica around the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, in the area of current-day Guatemala and the southern Mexico states of Tabasco, Chiapas, Oaxaca, and Veracruz, and the surrounding areas. Last year, as we went through the Book of Mormon for the Come Follow Me program, I quickly noticed something that I had never really stopped to ponder before, and that was just how specific the writers were to give us detail. Detail that could just as easily have been skipped to move on with the story. It begins immediately and never ceases throughout the entire book. For example, in 1 Nephi chapter 2, right off the bat, it tells us about Lehi's departure with his family into the wilderness. Now, Nephi could have simply said, and thus we departed into the wilderness with all our things, and we traveled for many days. After all, that would have conveyed the fact that they fled from before the invading forces of Nebuchadnezzar, and would have made the point that there was some urgency in the matter. But listen to how specific Nephi is. And it came to pass, speaking of his father, that he departed into the wilderness, and he left his house, and the land of his inheritance, and his gold, and his silver, and his precious things, and took nothing with him, save it were his family, and provisions, and tents, and departed into the wilderness. See, now he could have stopped right there, and we would have gotten the message that he left somewhat in haste. But no, he goes on. And he came down by the borders near the Red Sea, and he traveled in the borders which are nearer the Red Sea, and he did travel in the wilderness with his family. We have discussed in previous episodes that the borders, plural, as used here, was actually a proper name for the mountain range on the east side of the Red Sea. Those mountains are today called the Hejaz Mountains, and we have already discussed in previous episodes that Hejaz translates to boundary or barrier. So right off the bat, Nephi is telling us several things. They went south rather than north to the Mediterranean. They went down the east side of the Red Sea rather than on the west side. We are told that there are mountains on that side, which indeed there are, though not on the west side. And we are told that they traveled in the mountains near the Red Sea rather than along the seashore as some might have expected them to do. See, here, Nephi could just as easily have said, we left Jerusalem and traveled into the wilderness, and we did travel for the space of many days. It would have told the same action, only without the specific detail. Now, this is just the beginning, but it establishes a pattern that we will see throughout the Book of Mormon. And this is why I want to discuss this admittedly controversial subject with you today. No, the geography is not important per se, but it is details like these that have allowed modern day researchers to find and validate many of the claims of the Book of Mormon. I read recently that there were over 200 issues that the critics and skeptics and debunkers used to deny and denigrate the Book of Mormon since the days of Joseph Smith. And in his day, there was no defense against those criticisms other than just a solid and abiding testimony of the authenticity of the book. But today, it has been determined that, as I mentioned earlier, fully 85% of those arguments that the critics launched against the Book of Mormon have been proven to be true things, and the feeling is sure that the remaining 15% will certainly be proven soon. And they must be, because the book is true. Therefore, the things in it are true also. As the first Nephi narrative continues, we read that they stopped after 3 days by a river where Lehi spoke prophetically and blessed his sons. Here again, Nephi could have simply said, after 3 days we did stop. But he adds more detail. He says, and it came to pass that when he had traveled 3 days in the wilderness, he pitched his tent in a valley by the side of a river of water. Here again, more detail. We have spoken in the past of the significance of saying a river of water in previous episodes, so I'm going to move past that. We have much more to cover today, but I wanted to just point that out to you. Another thing I like in the journey out of Jerusalem was this. I have spoken to you before about the death of Ishmael, the man whose family accompanied Lehi's family as they traveled through the desert. In chapter 16 of 1 Nephi, it says, and it came to pass that Ishmael died and was buried in a place which was called Nahum. And notice that it says in a place which was called Nahum rather than we did call the place Nahum, indicating that it was an established place there in the wilderness. Of that event, Nephi could have simply said, Ishmael died and was buried along the way, and we did continue our journey through the wilderness. But he didn't. He says, and it came to pass that we did again take our journey in the wilderness, and we did travel nearly eastward from that time forth. And I like how he said nearly eastward. That's oddly specific, but consistent, because remember, by this time they had the Liahona with them, and it gave them where to go. Remember that it had 2 needles, and the inclusion of a second needle, a compass needle, gave them always a reference to the bearing that they were traveling relative to north. In this case, not eastward, but nearly eastward. Now, I can't take too much time here during their journey in the wilderness because I want to get to some of the specifics of their time in the promised land. But as you read the Book of Mormon, please stop and pay attention to how many times the prophets give you specific details above and beyond the general narratives that would otherwise suffice. I maintain that it is these specifics that give researchers today the clues they need to search out and find the support for the narrative. Once again, and I'm going to say it over and over, our testimonies are based on the witness of the Holy Ghost as to the truthfulness of this book. But for the world, these evidences are powerful motivators to look more closely at the claims of the Book of Mormon, and this often leads to the more spiritual investigation that will ultimately bring them to a real testimony. And I wonder, why have the prophets from the Book of Mormon made such a point to give us so very specific clues as to the locations of the events we read about? Let me give you some examples. Now, you may want to get some maps in front of you for this part. It would sure help a lot. A good and detailed map of Central America, and more specifically of Mexico and Guatemala would be perfect. Also, a good map that shows Pacific Ocean currents for one part, and maybe also one that shows the Atlantic currents as well. The map of Central America should be detailed enough to show topographical features, mountains and such, and particularly rivers. If you're listening while driving in your car or jogging, good on you. Keep listening, keep jogging, and you can go back later and follow up with what you hear now. So let's start with the ocean voyage for Lehi and Nephi. There are those who have proposed that they actually crossed the Atlantic Ocean in a somewhat tortured effort to get to Florida or up to New York where the plates were found. I don't see how this could possibly be. First Nephi clearly states that they went down the eastern side of the Red Sea and then turned nearly eastward at Nahum and traveled across what we now call the empty quarter of the Arabian Peninsula. This would have eventually landed them on the western shore of the Indian Ocean. Had they crossed the Atlantic, they would have had to have gone north to the Mediterranean, and from there they could have sailed west right out the Mediterranean and into the Atlantic. But for being at the shore of the Indian Ocean, that would have been folly to attempt that. It would have been virtually impossible to get into the Atlantic from Oman or Yemen, where we think they were. If you have found a good map of ocean currents, you can see that once they sailed across the Indian Ocean, they could have easily caught the Pacific counter current, which runs from the Philippines directly eastward across the Pacific and stops right at modern-day Guatemala. I believe, and remember this is just my opinion, but it works. I believe that they landed in Guatemala, in what today is Guatemala, obviously, and that the land of Nephi, which we read about all through the books of Nephi and Jacob, was centered very near or even in and around the valley which holds Guatemala City and local environs. Later on, I'll show you some scriptures that are very specific about that. In the meantime, 1 Nephi 18 speaks about the place they landed, and it says, "And it came to pass that we did till the earth, and we did begin to plant seeds, and we did put all our seeds into the earth, which we had brought from the land of Jerusalem. And it came to pass that they did grow exceedingly, wherefore we were blessed in abundance. And it came to pass that we did find upon the land of promise, as we journeyed in the wilderness, that there were beasts in the forest of every kind, both cow and the ox, and the ass and the horse, and the goat and the wild goat, and all manner of animals which were for the use of men. And we did find all manner of ore, both of gold and of silver and of copper." It would have been pretty hard to find that in Florida, but not so hard to find in Guatemala. And then as we begin 2 Nephi, we find Lehi speaking, and he declares that the place where they are is the promised land, the land of their inheritance. Now this is important. He says, "We have obtained a land of promise, a land which is choice above all other lands, a land which the Lord God hath covenanted with me should be the land for the inheritance of my seed." And then in 2 Nephi 5 we read, "And it came to pass that I, Nephi, did consecrate Jacob and Joseph, that they should be priests and teachers in the land of my people." Now he still hasn't called it the land of Nephi, but here he says, the land of my people. And as we proceed through the Book of Mormon, we come to the book of Jerem. This is a couple hundred years later, but we hear mention of the effort of the Lamanites to remove the Nephites from their promised lands. That would be the land of Nephi. Jerem 1:7 says this, "And it came to pass that they came many times against us, the Nephites, to battle. But our kings and our leaders were mighty men of faith of the Lord, and we withstood the Lamanites and swept them away out of our lands and began to fortify our cities or whatever place of our inheritance." So we see that the Lamanites had designs on the land of Nephi, and only a short while later, maybe 30 or 40 years, we read this, "Behold, I am Amaleki, the son of Abinadab. Behold, I will speak unto you somewhat concerning Mosiah, who is made king over the land of Zarahemla. For behold, he being warned of the Lord that he should flee out of the land of Nephi," See, there we finally get it called the land of Nephi. And as many as would hearken unto the voice of the Lord should also depart out of the land with him into the wilderness. And it came to pass that he did as the Lord had commanded him, and they departed out of the land into the wilderness, as many as would hearken unto the voice of the Lord, and they were led by many preachings and prophesyings. And they were admonished continually by the word of God, and they were led by the power of his arm through the wilderness until they came down into the land which is called Zarahemla. So now we see that there was a land of Nephi, and the Lamanites wanted it badly because it was so fertile and desirable. And we also see that there was a land of Zarahemla. This is when the Nephites were forced to give up their land of inheritance and flee northward to a new place, Zarahemla, where they met the Mulekites, a previously for like 400 years, unknown group of people who had also fled Jerusalem at the time of the Great Destruction. Now you'll notice that the narrative says that they went down to Zarahemla, and at the end of Omni, Malachi tells us that some of them tried to return to their old home in the land of Nephi, and he says in verse 27, "And now I would speak somewhat concerning a certain number who went up into the wilderness to return to the land of Nephi." This up and down relationship is more important to us than the north-south relationship that is indicated later. If you look at a topographical map, you will see that Guatemala, all of it mainly, well, all of the western part of it at least, is at a pretty high elevation over the flat lowlands of Mexico next to the Yucatan Peninsula. Guatemala City itself and its basin is situated at just under 5,000 feet. Well, down in the Yucatan and Merida and the cities down there along the Gulf are basically sea level or very close. Geographically, these two places are basically north and south to one another. And from this point on, the Nephites lived in and defended and died in the land of Zarahemla. But the fact that they went down from the land of Nephi to Zarahemla, and then they went back up to the land of Nephi in search of their old home, I believe is more than just an incidental description. I believe they literally did go down the mountains to the flatlands and had to go back up into the mountains to get back to the land of Nephi. As we go through this, I must comfort those of you who want to hear about the North American habitation of these people. That all does happen in later chapters of Alma, but yes, many do go very far north, almost certainly all the way up the Mississippi River into the Ohio valleys and the Great Lakes. And from there, it's just a very short journey over to Pennsylvania and New York. I needed to say that so that you don't think I'm excluding all of that. But the fact remains, at least I strongly believe, that virtually all of the primary Book of Mormon action takes place in Central America. And I say this because the lands of Nephi and Zarahemla are the focal points for most all of the action throughout the centuries of the Nephite-Lamanite battles, and also of the earlier Jaredite drama as well, which we will get to. In Omni 1:27 we read, "And now I would speak somewhat concerning a certain number who went up into the wilderness to return to the land of Nephi, for there was a large number who were desirous to possess the land of their inheritance." Okay, so we've established that the Nephites originally inherited the land of Nephi, and now that belonged to the Lamanites. And the Nephites were driven north to the land of Zarahemla, where they were welcomed by the Mulekites, and Mosiah became the king of all of that land. For reference, if you are actually looking on a map right now, I think the land of Zarahemla encompassed the land from just a little bit south of the Bay of Campeche on the left side of the Yucatan Peninsula, over to the west, probably as far as what today is the Tabasco, Chiapas, and Tuxtla regions. If you can find the right map, you may see that in the Campeche state, comprising the western half of the Yucatan, that is the place covered with cenotes. There are estimated to be upwards of 100,000 cenotes, or great pools of water dotting the landscape there. It's a very unique place, and it's primarily in the Yucatan and just to the west. In Mosiah 8, we read about this. It is speaking of these waters and a group of men sent out by King Limhi in the land of Lehi Nephi in search of Zarahemla. It says, "And they were lost in the wilderness for the space of many days, yet they were diligent, and found not the land of Zarahemla, but returned to this land, having traveled in a land among many waters, having discovered a land which was covered with dry bones of men and of beasts, and was covered with the ruins of buildings of every kind, having discovered a land which had been peopled with a people that were as numerous as the hosts of Israel." Those people were, of course, the Jaredites, as will be clearly established later. But the point is, the land was covered with enough individual pools of water to be of note, to say the many waters, and this fits perfectly with the physical reality of Campeche and the Yucatan. Had it just been one or two large lakes, I don't think it would have been mentioned at all, or only spoken of as a large body of water. But to say a land among many waters indicates something unique, and the cenotes of Yucatan are truly unique as to their number and concentration. As you read the Book of Mormon, you are constantly reading about the wars and battles fought among the Nephites and the Lamanites. Now remember that when Ammon, sent by Mosiah to find their lost brethren, those who had years earlier left Zarahemla in a vain effort to return to the land of Nephi, found instead King Limhi and the land of Lehi Nephi, he and those with him must have been traveling towards what they thought was the land of Nephi. In other words, they must have been traveling back to the high country and into the mountains where they knew the land of Nephi was. So it follows that when they encountered King Limhi and his people, they were near, or at least nearer to the Lamanite-held lands than to Zarahemla. And in fact, this is supported by the fact that Limhi's people were under subjugation to the king of the Lamanites. As Limhi recounted for Ammon the history of his people, he told of Zeniff, the man who had led the expedition out of Zarahemla so long ago during the time of the first King Mosiah. In that account, we read Zeniff's own words, saying, "I, being overzealous to inherit the land of our fathers," see, that's the original promised land, "collected as many as were desirous to go up," and see, there's that up again, "to go up to possess the land, and started again on our journey to go up to the land, but we were smitten with famine and sore affliction, for we were slow to remember our God. Nevertheless, after many days wandering in the wilderness, we pitched our tents in the place where our brethren were slain." And then it says this, "which was near to the land of our fathers." In other words, it was near to the land of Nephi, which is now held by the Lamanites. So that establishes that the land of King Limhi was in the highlands near the land of Nephi, now possessed by the Lamanites and ruled over by their king. That king, King Laman, made a treaty with Limhi's people to possess the land of Lehi Nephi and there build a city of Shilom. But as they prospered, they learned that it had all been a trick to subjugate them and enslave them. We read just a few verses later, "Now it was the cunning and the craftiness of King Laman to bring my people into bondage, that he yielded up the land that we might possess it." You can read the rest of that story in Mosiah 9, but I wanted to establish that the land of Lehi Nephi was between the lands of Zarahemla and Nephi, and that it was nearer to the land of Nephi, where the Lamanite king could rule over it. Now, let me just say here for perspective that the distance between the Guatemala basin, the Guatemala City basin, if you will, and the state of Tabasco is only about 200 miles. So not really that far for people who have wandered for many days to cover. The Book of Mormon makes mention of, quote, "a narrow neck of land," close quote, that separates the land masses into the land of desolation and the land of abundance. So we probably should take a look at that. One of the mistakes many people made in the earlier days of the church, and I have to admit, even during my time 50 years ago as a missionary, was to go to the obvious assumption that the narrow neck of land was the Isthmus of Panama. It was just too obvious that this must be what they were talking about. But here again, this led to confusion because none of the rest of the narrative worked with regard to location and geography. Another reason why the people did not want to discuss the Book of Mormon geography early on. Instead, if we look at the area of Tehuantepec and Tuxtla in the middle of Mexico, suddenly everything fits and everything makes sense. So let's look at a description of that narrow neck of land. And for that, we'll turn to the book of Ether, which is about the Jaredites. But remember, we are supposing that the Jaredites landed their barges according to the ocean currents we already discussed. And if that is the case, then they would have necessarily landed somewhere right around that Tehuantepec area. In Ether chapter 10, we read of a man named Lib who was, quote, good in the sight of the Lord. And we can pick up the action in verse 19. It says, and it came to pass that Lib also did that which was good in the sight of the Lord. And in the days of Lib, the poisonous snakes were destroyed. Wherefore they did go into the land southward. See, a specific detail there, the land southward, to hunt food for the people of the land. For the land was covered with animals of the forest. And they built a great city by the narrow neck of land, by the place where the sea divides the land. Now, right here, there's just nowhere in America, in the United States, where any land would fit this description. You've got sea on the east coast, and you've got sea on the west coast, but nowhere could you call it a narrow neck of land where the sea divides the land east to west, other than maybe the Isthmus of Florida hanging down there, but nothing else about the description in the Book of Mormon could possibly fit anything else in Florida. And if we go to the only other reference to this narrow neck of land, we see that it is very near to Zarahemla, because Alma 63 says this, and it came to pass that in the 37th year of the reign of the judges there was a large company of men, even to the amount of 5,400 men, with their wives and their children, departed out of the land of Zarahemla into the land which is northward. So this shows us that the actions with Alma and the people after him was all still happening in the land of Zarahemla. And the next verse puts an even more precise location for that land. It says, and it came to pass that Haggith, he being an exceedingly curious man, therefore he went and built him an exceedingly large ship on the borders of the land Bountiful, by the land Desolation, and launched it forth into the West Sea by the narrow neck of land northwards. And behold, there were many of the Nephites who did enter therein and did sail forth with much provisions, and also many women and children, and they took their course northward, and thus ended the 37th year. Now we have here two migrations to the north. The first was by land. Those people traveled on foot or by wagons. It's not specified just how, but the only place they could go was up through modern-day Mexico until they reached Arizona or Texas. And from there they were free to spread wheresoever they wished, and they had the whole of the rest of North America to do so. But what of the people who traveled in the boats made by Haggith? Most of us, as we read the Book of Mormon in the past, just naturally assumed that they went to Hawaii and or Polynesia. And it is very possible that other people in other boats made by Haggith did so. After all, he was a boat builder, so it's fair to assume that he made boats before this time, and we will see in just a couple of verses that he made other boats after this time. But for the journey mentioned here, we must look more closely. If we see the land Bountiful as the Yucatan, and let that western boundary of Yucatan come down the west side of the peninsula right to the Bay of Campeche, we notice that the bay establishes the northern side of the narrow neck of land spoken about. We would then have Bountiful be the Yucatan Peninsula extending westward to the Bay of Campeche, with Zarahemla sitting right below it, being mainly Chiapas and Tuxtla and part of Tabasco, sitting on top of, or north of, we should say, Guatemala, the land of Nephi. Again, I have to say that having a map in front of you will help a lot with this visualization. Now, looking again at verse 5, it says, He built him an exceedingly large ship on the borders of the land Bountiful, by the land Desolation. See, that would be the land beginning, by their own definition, at the narrow neck of land and launching it forth into the West Sea. Now, let me stop here for just a minute. It might seem obvious that this would be referring to the Pacific Ocean. But if you look at the map, you will see that the only access to the Pacific Ocean, there from that narrow neck of land, would have been down south, and you could only travel west. You could not travel north. And here, I'm going to point you to the fact that for people living in the land of Bountiful on the Yucatan Peninsula, and for people from Zarahemla familiar with the land of Bountiful, the peninsula itself would seem to be bounded by a sea to the west and a sea to the east. So I think we are talking about simply the water to the west side of the Yucatan that would make this whole verse perfectly clear. They launched their boat into the Bay of Campeche, it says, by the narrow neck of land which led northward. And more importantly, that would mean that this voyage was not in the Pacific, but rather in the Gulf, which we now call the Gulf of America, also known as the Gulf of Mexico. And just one more point here. Traveling by sea approximately northward from the Bay of Campeche would have taken our travelers right up to and around the eastern tip of Texas or Louisiana. And that means that they could have easily found the mouth of the Mississippi River. I bring this up now because a little later in Alma's story, there's an indication that they must have traveled up the Mississippi all the way to the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes, and spread from there into all parts of the U.S., including New York. We can read this in the next verses of chapter 63. And in the 38th year, this man built other ships, and the first ship did also return, and many more people did enter into it. And they also took much provisions, and set out again to the land northward. And it came to pass that they were never heard from again. And it came to pass that one other ship also did sail forth, and whether she did go, we know not. And it came to pass that in this year there were many people who went forth into the land northward, and thus into the 38th year. Now, it's interesting that the record says they never were heard from again, because when we get to the book of Helaman, we get a very detailed account of what those people found and where they went. So let's go there now. And as we do, please notice that we are getting a great amount of very specific geographical detail that didn't need to be in there if it was not of value to us today. These writers wanted us to know the details of their journeys and migrations. So I feel it is important that we understand all of this, and I feel that as this unfolds to our understanding, we can only stand in amazement at the perfect correlation of the Book of Mormon with modern day knowledge and understanding. Okay, in Helaman 3, we find the continuation of this saga, and there are very many fascinating details to be found. It is now 8 years later, the 46th year of the reign of the judges, and it says, beginning in verse 3, there was much contention and many dissensions, in the which there were an exceedingly great many who departed out of the land of Zarahemla. See, Zarahemla is still where the Book of Mormon action is happening, and went forth unto the land northward to inherit the land. And they did travel to an exceedingly great distance, insomuch that they came to large bodies of water and many rivers. Now, I believe that those large bodies of water are the Great Lakes, and it says in many rivers, and those could have been, in addition to the Mississippi River, the Missouri, the Platte, the Arkansas, the Ohio, the Tennessee, and the Red Rivers just to mention a few. There are others as well, but those are plenty for me. And it says, Yea, and they did spread forth into all parts of the land, into whatever parts had not been rendered desolate and without timber. Now listen to this. Because of the many inhabitants who had before inherited the land. Now, I don't know about you, but to me this clearly indicates that from Zarahemla there had to be, and in fact was, a great and large landmass to the north, past the narrow neck of land. Now, those who believe that all this was happening right off the bat in the northern United States to begin with, might say, well, yes, but they're talking about Canada. But the description just doesn't fit. Where is the narrow neck of land? Where did they build their boat? And where did they set sail? If they traveled to an exceedingly great distance to get to the large bodies of water, i.e. the Great Lakes, where did they sail from? If we begin in Mexico, then it all fits and makes perfect sense. And it also makes perfect sense and fits with the previously discussed ocean currents that we talked about that would have deposited the Nephites in Guatemala and the Jaredites in Tehuantepec. Please understand, I am not trying to squeeze these details into my own personal narrative. Rather, I am trying to follow the path of details left by the writers who obviously wanted us to know where they were and what they were facing. By the way, there's one other interesting passage concerning this migration northward that I want to share with you. In Helaman 7, which occurs roughly 30 years after this great migration, Nephi, the son of Helaman, goes north to preach to these people as well. But chapter 7 begins negatively. It says, Behold, it came to pass in the 69th year of the reign of the judges over the people of the Nephites, that Nephi, the son of Helaman, returned to the land of Zarahemla from the land northward. And notice that they never give the land northward a name ever in the Book of Mormon. For he had been forth among the people who were in the land northward, and did preach the word of God unto them, and did prophesy many things unto them. And they did reject all his words, insomuch that he could not stay among them, but returned again unto the land of his nativity. You see, that Nephi, son of Helaman, was born in Zarahemla. This is further evidence that Zarahemla was and would remain the center of activity for all the Book of Mormon Nephite people. The book of 3rd Nephi clearly begins in Zarahemla, and now we are 11 years after the birth of the Lord and moving towards the Lord's crucifixion in a few decades. All the action is taking place here in Zarahemla. For example, we read in 3rd Nephi chapter 4, where the Nephite army is taking on Gideonhi, and after they drove him out, it says in verse 15, And it came to pass that the armies of the Nephites did return to their place of security, which of course was Zarahemla. Well, this was a time when the Gadianton robbers were running amok in the land, and for a time the Nephites fled. But we see once again in chapter 6, now just 5 years before the coming of the Savior, that as they could, they always returned to Zarahemla. Verse 1 says, And now it came to pass that the people of Nephi did all return to their own lands. And as the narrative continues, we see that the people of Zarahemla continued to struggle all the way up to the sign of the crucifixion of the Savior. So finally, in chapter 8, when the great destructions come, we see that Zarahemla did take fire, it says. In chapter 9, the Lord speaks to the people of the land from out of the heavens, and the first thing he mentions is the city of Zarahemla. He says, Behold, that great city of Zarahemla have I burned with fire. And we read that when the Lord did appear, he came to the people that were gathered in the land Bountiful, which was next to the land of Zarahemla. Now there's so much more. In fact, the whole book is filled with geographical hints meant for us. We don't have a lot of time, but let's keep going a bit more, shall we? The River Sidon is an important waterway through the jungle, and I imagine a most convenient way to travel. A few details about it that you should know. For one, it traveled south to north, or we could say from the land of Nephi to the land of Zarahemla. There is really not any river in the continental United States that travels south to north, but in the area we have been studying, there is. In fact, there are two. There is the Rio Grijalva or the Usumacinta River. They both fit the description found in the Book of Alma. They both start in the highlands of Guatemala, and they both run north through the land of Zarahemla and come together just before emptying into the Gulf at the Bay of Campeche. In chapter 2 of Alma, we begin with this description. And it came to pass that the Amlicites came upon the hill Amnihu, which was on the east side of the river Sidon, which ran by the land of Zarahemla, and there began to make war with the Nephites. Here the Lamanites and the Amlicites crossed the river, but the Nephites were strong in the Lord, and it says their enemies did flee before them. And then in verse 34 it says, and again notice all this detail, and thus he cleared the ground, or rather the bank, which was on the west side of the river Sidon, throwing the bodies of the Lamanites who had been slain into the waters of Sidon, that thereby his people might have room to cross and contend with the Lamanites and the Amlicites on the west side of the river Sidon. And in Alma 6 we read, when Alma had made these regulations, he departed from them, yea, from the church which was in the city of Zarahemla, and went over upon the east side of the river Sidon into the valley of Gideon. And then a few chapters later, in chapter 8, we read, and Alma departed from thence and took his journey over into the land of Melech on the west side of the river Sidon, on the west side by the borders of the wilderness. So see, that could be a mountain range on the west side over there. And if you look at your map, you'll see that there is a whole mountain range running north and south, fronting the Pacific Ocean, which would be on the west side of Zarahemla. This could have put him in the very southwestern tip of modern Chiapas, which, by the way, is bordered on the west by mountains that front the Pacific Ocean, as I just said. And notice that once again, we see the use of the term borders rather than border, perhaps indicating mountains as they did in 1 Nephi. There are lots of mountains down there. They are the continuation of the Rockies and the Sierra Madres in the north and continue all the way down the western side of South America, where they're called the Andes. I want to share with you one more verse which has a ton of geographical clues in it. It may be the longest verse in the Book of Mormon. Remember that I said that there was a land of Nephi and a city of Nephi, just as there was a land of Zarahemla and a city of Zarahemla? The lands of these two cities contained other cities as well, and some also had other subdivisions of land, also called lands. They were lands within lands. We could almost think of them as counties within a state. Anyway, this verse, Alma 22, verse 27, it's a bit complicated, but it will show the level of detail and pretty well indicate that the author really wanted us to know where he was talking about. Here goes. And it came to pass that the king sent a proclamation throughout the land amongst all his people who were in all his land, who were in all the regions round about, which was bordering even to the sea, on the east and on the west, and which was divided from the land of Zarahemla by a narrow strip of wilderness, which ran from the sea east even to the sea west, and round about on the borders of the seashore, and the borders of the wilderness, which was on the north by the land of Zarahemla, through the borders of Manti, by the head of the river Sidon, running from the east towards the west, and thus were the Lamanites and the Nephites divided. Now, this narrow neck of wilderness is not the narrow neck of land. If you look on a map, you'll see this was a strip of mountains that ran east and west between what we've been describing as the land of Zarahemla and the land of Nephi. Once again, a good map to reference would help a lot. I guess I actually should do a YouTube video of this so I could show you on the map myself, and perhaps I will do that. I'm just not very smart, and YouTube kind of intimidates me. But for now, just trust me, and we can keep going, and you can come back later and get maps and do it all yourself. The map I'm looking at is a very good map of the topography of this whole Central America region. And the verse I just read is talking about the land of a king who was the father of King Lamoni, who had been converted by Aaron, one of the sons of Mosiah. Aaron and Lamoni went up to the land of Lamoni's father, who was the big king over much of the land of Nephi. The chapter heading wants us to know that it is going to tell us how the land was divided. So here again we see evidence that the author wants us to understand this Book of Mormon geography. Let's see, the verse says he had all the land bordering even to the sea on the east and on the west, and that it was divided from the land of Zarahemla by a narrow strip of wilderness, which ran from the sea east even to the sea west. It then talks about the mountains on the west by the sea also, and if we look carefully at the map of Guatemala, we can clearly see the mountains running up and down the western shore of the Pacific Ocean, and then across from west to east along the middle of Guatemala, north of the valley that holds Guatemala City. North of that, actually comprising the northern strip of land that is also part of Guatemala, we find nice flat lowlands of modern-day Petén. And we can also see another narrow piece of land between the Pacific and the Gulf of Honduras. I know it's hard to follow if you're not in front of a map, but what I want you to notice is that this is all geography. And not only did the authors of the Book of Alma, for example, take the time and space to write about it in such detail, but Mormon also, tasked with editing the whole thing, thought this was worth keeping in. And remember, he said, I cannot write 100th part, and yet this was important to keep in. As I read these things, I can't believe that we are not supposed to study them. I have flown over these lands many times, and I have seen with my own eyes the two great rivers which flow through this land, the Rio Grijalva on the west and the Usumacinta River on the east, which actually forms the northern half of the border between Guatemala and Mexico. Chapter 22 continues on with extraordinary geographical detail. It says, now the more idle part of the Lamanites lived in the wilderness and dwelt in tents, and they were spread through the wilderness on the west in the land of Nephi, yea, and also on the west of the land of Zarahemla in the borders by the seashore. Now you see right off the bat, mountains along the seashore west of the land of Zarahemla. It says that the Lamanites lived in there as well. And on the west in the land of Nephi, in the place of their father's first inheritance, and thus bordering along the seashore. So it comes back just to remind us that when Lehi and Nephi and their families landed, that place on the west of the land of Nephi was the place of their first inheritance, and that was the place bordering the seashore. In other words, they came in from the sea, and that's where they started. This verse is telling us that Lehi's family first landed west of the Guatemala City basin, as it says, on the west in the land of Nephi, bordering the seashore. The western side of Mexico, below the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, is very mountainous, leaving the flatlands more to the east, all the way up to and through the Yucatan Peninsula. When this verse says that the more idle part of the Lamanites lived in the wilderness west of the land of Nephi, and also west of the land of Zarahemla, that clearly points to the mountains on the Pacific coast and gives us an even better visualization of these places. I don't think we have time to discuss today the land of Hermounts, which was a wilderness known as the land of wild and ravenous beasts, and was on the west side of the river Sidon in those same mountains, but that sure fits nicely with the land to the west of the Rio Grijalva today. The river Sidon flowed from the highlands of Guatemala, the land of Nephi, down to the lowlands of southern Mexico, Zarahemla, until it emptied into the Bay of Campeche. In other words, it flowed from south to north. And as I stated earlier, there is no river in the continental United States that flows from south to north and fits in any way the description we find here in Alma 22. This absolutely had to be speaking of Mexico and Guatemala. Of course, the books of Helaman and 4th Nephi, as well as Mormon's own book, detail the sad and horrifying end of the Nephite people, and I will spare you the trauma of that. But I will show from the book of Ether that this end occurred right in this land we've been focused on, the land of Zarahemla and the lands just to the north and maybe a little bit to the east as well, but more importantly, not in New York State. So I can't end the day without talking about the Jaredites of the Book of Ether just a little bit. They were actually the first stewards of the Promised Land, at least as far as the Book of Mormon is concerned. They came over after a miraculous journey floating on the ocean currents for 344 days before landing in the same area as the Mulekites, or in other words, very near the land of Zarahemla. Just 2 episodes ago, I spoke of this at length, so I think we're going to have to pass by that detail of the journey to get to the rest of what we need to talk about today. But suffice it to say, there is very strong evidence that the Jaredites landed on the west side of Mexico, right at or just north of the narrow neck of land we now call the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. This was the demarcation of the land of desolation and the land of abundance. And while their history allows for migrations north into the United States, just as the Nephite history does, most of the action we read about in the Book of Ether takes place right in and around the land of Zarahemla, though that's not what they called it. That's where their bones were found, and that's where the 24 gold plates of ether were found by King Limhi's people while they were looking for the city of Zarahemla. As with the Nephite prophets, the Jaredite prophets were just as careful to give us geographical references as to their whereabouts and doings, and it only makes sense that they would find themselves in the same place as the Nephites much later. After all, this was the promised land, the land saved by the Lord for his people when they followed his commands and kept his covenants. The Jaredites were given this land for an inheritance first, and it would have stayed their land if they hadn't turned away from the Lord. But because they did, they were swept off the land, and the Lord brought in a new covenant people. Sadly, the Nephites only lasted half as long as the Jaredites did, but between them both, we get a rich and extraordinary history of the people the Lord allowed to live on this promised land. Perhaps there's a message in there for us today, don't you think? So let's take a few more minutes, and if you can stand it, of course, and see what the Book of Ether has to share with us. And it has a lot. To begin, let me say that there are a lot of places and names, and none of them will be the same as the Nephite names, naturally. But as it is Moroni giving us this abridgment of Ether's words, he will at times orient us as to the places Ether is speaking about. Now, the first 5 chapters of Ether are about the Jaredites' journey across Asia and the journey in the barges they made to both cross the many waters of Asia that existed at that time and also the barges with which they crossed the Pacific. It's not until chapter 6 where we finally get them to the Promised Land, and we read in verse 12, "And they did land upon the shore of the Promised Land." In chapter 7, we get some reference. They are already having battles one with another by this time, and the king lives in a place called Moron, and Moroni says, "Now the land of Moron, where the king dwelt, was near the land which is called Desolation by the Nephites." So here we have our first clue, and also verification that we are talking about the same land in general as found in the Nephite record. And then it says that the land was divided into 2 kingdoms, the kingdom of Shul and the kingdom of Kohor, showing that the pattern of the Nephites with their battles with the Lamanites was not so unique. It seems that there would always be 2 sides to every civilization. In chapter 9, we read something very interesting, and it gives us more clarity on the demise of the Nephites. It says, And the Lord warned Omer in a dream that he should depart out of the land. Wherefore Omer departed out of the land with his family, and traveled many days, and came over and passed by the hill of Shem, and came to the place where the Nephites were destroyed, and from thence eastward, and came to a place which was called Ablom by the seashore. This is important because while we don't know exactly where this all took place, we can be certain that we are still somewhere near the land of desolation, which was by the narrow neck of land defined by the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. And so when it says that they traveled from the place where the Nephites were destroyed eastward to Ablom by the seashore, we can assume that Moroni is talking about the Gulf waters of the Bay of Campeche as the seashore. Why this is important is because it pretty much eliminates New York State and the area around Cumorah as the scene of the final Nephite-Lamanite battle. This also lends credence to the growing idea of there being two Cumorahs. The idea that Moroni buried the plates in a hill near his home or near Tehuantepec, called Cumorah by his people, and then, when Joseph Smith accepted the call to serve the Lord commanded Moroni to take the plates to New York, where he made a stone vault for them in a hill nearby. This is an idea that I actually hold to, but we should really save that for another day. Throughout both the records of the Nephites and the records of the Jaredites, it is made clear that their people spread far and wide, and we have already seen evidence of the large migration of some of the Jaredites, and later some of the Nephites, to the far north lands, including most probably all the way to the Great Lakes and the upper Ohio Valley, as well as New York and Pennsylvania, and to the west as well. That's why I said at the beginning that both theories could be true, at least in part. There definitely were Nephites and almost certainly Jaredites before them in the continental United States. Nevertheless, the vast majority of the Book of Ether, like the rest of the Book of Mormon, stayed in and around the lands of Zarahemla and Nephi throughout the record. The man Mormon lived in the land of Zarahemla and made his record somewhere in the vicinity. These were the lands most ardently fought over, which makes sense as these were the lands declared by the Lord to be the promised land. We're just about finished for today, but let's look at just a few more cases where the Jaredites speak of the same lands as the Nephites. We get evidence that the land of Zarahemla was prime real estate for the Jaredites. Now, the land was referred to by the Nephites as desolation, and we can see supporting evidence of that in verses 30 and 31 of Ether 9. And it came to pass that there began to be a great dearth upon the land, and the inhabitants began to be destroyed exceedingly fast because of the dearth. For there was no rain upon the face of the earth. And there came forth poisonous serpents upon the face of the land, and did poison many people. And it came to pass that their flocks began to flee before the poisonous serpents towards the land southward, which was called by the Nephites Zarahemla. So here we see that they were definitely north of Zarahemla, which would put them right at the boundary of, or even into, the land of desolation. More importantly, though, it keeps them in and near Zarahemla, which will be important as we get to their ultimate destruction. Remember, King Limhi's people found their record somewhere between his land and the land of Zarahemla. We see one more reference to the land filled with serpents, and it's in chapter 10, verse 19, and it says, "And it came to pass that Lib also did that which was good in the sight of the Lord." Now, I read this to you way earlier in the podcast, but let's do it again. "And in the days of Lib the poisonous serpents were destroyed, wherefore they did go into the land southward to hunt food for the people of the land. for the land was covered with animals of the forest. And they built a great city by the narrow neck of land, by the place where the sea divides the land. And they did preserve the land southward for a wilderness to get game, and the whole face of the land northward was covered with inhabitants. So from this we can see clearly that the Jaredite population was centered around the Tehuantepec area, the narrow neck of land, as they called it. And it seems that as they spread, their expansion was mainly to the north, into the land of desolation, as it would later be called. They viewed the land of the south as a rich food source and protected it, kind of like a game preserve, if you will. And so it appears that they never ventured into the lands we call the land of Nephi, and maybe only very slightly into the lands of Zarahemla, at least the southern part of those lands. This is also indicated by what we read back in Helaman of the reports from the Nephites who migrated far north, that they found a land that had been inhabited before by a people who were numerous but now gone. I could go on, and so could you, but I think the point is well made today. The Book of Mormon prophets wanted us to know where they lived and have an idea as they told us of their journeys and exploits back and forth among these lands. Had it not been important to them, they would not have included so much detail, and Mormon would not have put it all in his abridgment. But I think there was a grander plan afoot. I think the Lord knew the book would at first be greatly criticized and rejected by the wise men of the world. But by putting in all the clues he did, he knew that the day would come when those very same clues would point to the truth and the authenticity of the book to the world. Perhaps they would not convert people per se, but they would open the door to serious inquiry and study, and that would lead to opportunities for the Holy Ghost to testify to the curious, and thus build testimonies that would convert them. I do not think that it was just by happenstance that Moroni's promise appears at the end of the Book of Mormon. I think it simply marked the beginning of the lifelong journeys into this marvelous book and the stories it tells. I've been reading it for 6 decades now, and I'm not through. I hope you're not either. I'm so glad you made it this far, and I apologize for running so long, but it is such a rich subject, and it was such a privilege for me to spend the hours this week to prepare it for you. So I say, have a great week. I'm Mark Swint. Thank you for listening.